What's up there, Workforce? Chris here with Work to Game, and today it is time to do another versus video. But this time it's Final Fantasy XIV versus Final Fantasy XIV. Now this week is brought to you by our Patreon, so definitely feel free to consider becoming one in the link below. And I do want to thank these two Patreons right here. And let's go ahead and get started. Now the reason I want to compare 14 to 14 is there is two major systems that have been introduced into the game that have made a repetition in this expansion, an expansion to those systems. And I think it's time to talk about who did it better. Now, the first system I'm going to talk about is Eureka. Now, we know that we're going to be getting another piece to Eureka. We have another live letter coming up very, very soon. And so that is a big piece to focus on in this. And then the other system is Deep Dungeon. Now, I want to introduce you to these systems because if you haven't compared them directly, we need to know where they came from. So I've talked a little bit about this in past videos, but Eureka actually, to sum up, comes from a combination of Diadem and the previous Relic systems. And so this time you can get Relic Weapon, Relic Armor. We'll see what that looks like in the 5.0 series. But for the remainder of this expansion, we expect it to be updated at least one more time, probably a much more than one, maybe two more times? I don't know. And it's going to be this system of ever-evolving gear where it has its own alternate progression system, and it is meant to be a huge time dump for people who want to spend a direct time conversion into pretty decent gear instead of going into Savage or Ultimate, which we found they're kind of withdrawing from. Now, Deep Dungeon is actually another alternative progression system. We saw Palace of the Dead, now we see Heaven on High, and that is a literal port. And they are saying, okay, let's take what we learned from Palace of the Dead, let's push it into Heaven on High, and let's go in and we can run in parties of 1 to 4. It's this more like almost Super Nintendo dungeon crawler-esque content where you're seeing how far you can make it, and there really isn't a limit on that other than the fact that you can only get up to a certain amount of gear level, and then they only release the floors in certain chunks. So they've got 100 floors right now. They've said they're not planning on releasing more. I wouldn't be shocked if they change that, add another 50 floors, add another 100 floors, whatever they want to do. I would love to see them just put it unlimited and just have it scale up and see how far people can make it. That would just be intriguing to me. Really kind of engage in making that a better version of what it is and more against kind of the Rift system from Diablo. I think it's an awesome way to bring this game's beautiful, lovely combat system in these classes into a system that really drives that. They're both great ways of getting decent gear or better for endgame. Let's not really focus on that right now. And Eureka is more geared towards endgame players, and Heaven on High is more geared towards 60s to 70s and endgame players. So they both have an ability to focus on endgame there, so that's one more thing that they have in common. But as we start to break this apart, we will note that Heaven on High is actually the ability to level up characters, and that is one of the key differences here. It has this ability to level up characters. Now both games have a leveling progression system in right now, and both games cap 99.99 and level 20. That will be expanded. We know that we think that's going to level 30 with Pagos, and then I assume level 40 with the next one, and we'll just keep progressing there. And they both have the ability to bring gear out into the world that could at least be used as cosmetic, but could be used as some form of progression for at least casual players at the time of its release. It will obviously become outdated over time, like any other piece of gear, but, you know, Eureka has this set that you're going to be able to continue to upgrade throughout the expansion, and it has a whole set of armor and a whole set of weapons, and while both games you can achieve getting that armor on whatever class you want because it's a currency that's exchanged for it. So I could play my warrior in either pieces of content and pick up gear for my white mage. The Eureka content seems like it's going to be something that long-term is going to hold a lot more value. Now, when we talk about which game is more engaging, I think Heaven on High requires you to pay attention non-stop. As a matter of fact, a pull can, at the very last second, just wipe you, and then you lose all kinds of progress if you're trying to go really deep into it, and you're not just farming that 21 to 30 over and over and over and over. And when you wipe in it, you get nothing. You get nothing for that whole run. Now, we talk about Heaven on High. When you wipe in it, if you die, you can either be rezzed, and then it's no big deal. It's like it never happened, or you can accept a res by you can return, and when you return, you actually give up experience. You can even give up levels. And so, you know, I would say that as punishing as that is, it's a little more forgiving than how many hours you feel like you lose if you die in Heaven on High. Even if you don't really lose that many hours, it feels like a huge loss. And so I would say there's a big difference there. Now, when it comes to the ability to kind of engage large numbers of players, Heaven on High is very easily to solo, so I think it's very flexible content in that long term, if somebody wants to sit in there, they can. But Eureka does a great job of bringing in huge numbers of players at the same time. That's not to say there aren't those players in Heaven on High, but you don't feel it because you only see the number that are currently waiting outside. You don't see how many are inside. So I would probably give the number of players it engages over to Eureka, even if Heaven on High actually draws a larger percentage of the server. And I think over the course of an expansion, because of that replayability, that's going to also shift in that Eureka-style favor. So really, that's kind of what I think of these. I just thought it would be fun to do a quick versus between the two. And so the question here is really, if we want to start kind of weighing down how does it shake out, as I've gone back and forth on explaining what they are and what they do a little different than each other and what they do different than their predecessor, the question is, which one is the bigger improvement? Which one is the better step forward for Stormblood? The Eureka over the previous Diadem and Relic systems, or Heaven on High over Palace of the Dead? Now, when comparing these, you have to see who stepped further into the future, who took a better job listening to the past. Now, when it comes to the largest difference, I would give that to Eureka. It took Diadem, it took Relic systems, it mixed it all together, and it took a huge step forward and is actually going to continue to be updated over the course of the expansion, meaning it has all kinds of progress that we hope to still see. They don't have to make any more changes with Pagos, but we're expecting some quality of life changes, and as long as those land on their feet, it is going to by far be the bigger step forward in total amount of change over where it came from. Now, which game wore it better? Well, Eureka actually devolved into this NM train, at least here on the North American servers, and so it never really landed being the content that it was, as opposed to Heaven on High is being played correctly from day one, and people love it for that, and people are grinding through it for that, and people are pushing to clear, and they're not just cheesing it. And so they are legitimately farming it because there isn't this loophole in it. And so when it comes to which content was better engaged in what I believe the design intent was, I would have to give that to Heaven on High. Now, when it comes to which content is going to have the longer lasting appeal over the entire expansion, I would have to once again give that to Eureka because it's getting updated and they've kind of made it clear that this is kind of our one deep dungeon and we may not get any more updates to this for the rest of the expansion, and then in 5.3 we'll get a new deep dungeon, and so it's really there for those sweet, sweet glamour weapons, and that's about it, and an amazingly diverse loot table. And so that brings me to the next thing. What is the more fun content if you don't need the gear? From a value to your account standpoint, not necessarily fun. So what has the better loot table? And I would say that I would have to give it to Heaven on High. Heaven on High has all these minions, they have a mount, they have hairstyles, they have all this stuff, and actually a huge piece of that loot table is pulling from past stuff like Diadem, and so I think that's really engaging on a loot standpoint. So we are very much at 2-2 unless I've lost count. And so then the next thing is, which one is going to make you more money? Well, while they have the more interesting loot table, over time those are going to get very diluted, just like treasure maps. And so I would say that the ability to farm Materia and things like that in loot boxes per hour is going to very much be in Eureka's favor. I have made a ton of money running Eureka. You can cap on Mendacity very quickly, so sitting there 4 to 5 hours a week can make you a ton of money. Now, that shifts it back to Eureka's favor. And so then I ask, well, which one is the more fun? Which one are people, and I base this on community outrage, I base this on the number of changes it needs to have made in its current state, what we expect from Pagos and what we expect from the Deep Dungeon after Heaven on High. And I would say that Heaven on High has clearly landed better. It is something that people love it just the way it is. If they never liked Deep Dungeon, this is not going to be a change for them. As opposed to Eureka, there's a huge amount of the community that wanted it, got in it, and is done with it. And I never want to see it again. It is incredibly boring. I know there's people who like it, but I spent weeks trying to grow to like it, and ultimately the best way I found to engage with it was to do something else in a picture-in-picture. I ended up playing WoW, but that could be watching Netflix on your TV, that could be reading a book. Ultimately, pick a different $15 a month subscription, engage with that content, and your Eureka progression will feel like it went faster. And I think that's a real problem with the content. That's a real sign that people don't enjoy it. If to make a content fun, I have to go pick another piece of content outside of the game, that's a problem. And so that kind of shifts us back into, I feel these are pretty evenly weighted. And so if I had to lean in which direction, I would base it entirely on that last piece, because we play this game for entertainment and we play this game for fun. So in the past, I've always kind of considered all of the different, sections. I talk about comparing these games as equals and we just tally up the votes, but ultimately we play this game for fun. We play it for entertainment value. So being able to get to the best gear, which will eventually be outdated in future patches, being able to get loot that you could also just go buy by farming money. Ultimately, all of those things are just things, and either they will become something that we forget about, or they will become something that doesn't matter. And so really we play this game for entertainment value, the stories, all of that, because when we're in the 5.0, 6.0, 7.0, 8.0, and we're looking back, and we've long since gotten hundreds more minions, replaced our gear dozens if not hundreds of times, leveled up all of our classes to cap. We've done all of these things. What we're going to remember is the good times we had. And the good times we had are going to be in Heaven on High as opposed to Eureka. The exception being for the ERPers and that kind of RP element. But I think by and large across the majority of the population of this game, going in there, telling the war stories of, oh, and we had it, and then we wiped on 79, and then we made it to 91, and then a guy disconnected. And so those are going to be the stories that stick with you, not how many hours you AFK'd in Eureka. That's my personal opinion on that. So I would ultimately shift this in Heaven on High's direction, in which game landed it better, as far as which alternate progression system took a previous system in the game, improved it, and it has ultimately become a stronger piece of Stormblood content. I think Eureka is still in a position where there is a large number of new players that if they got to cap and that was the newest content at the time and they went into it, they'd be like, why did I do this? And they're very likely to eventually unsubscribe and decide if this isn't the game for them. And if they do like that content, that's a problem in its own, because it's so different than the rest of the expansion. The moment it becomes outdated, they're going to be bored with all this dungeons and stuff like that, and trials, because that's way too active for the grindiness that they grew accustomed to. So I think Heaven on High is the better fit for the mold, and I would love to know what you guys think. I'm sure throughout the video people have already just said, oh man, you missed something, Chris. I feel differently than you, or I think there's another thing you could compare between these two, and I would love to start that conversation in the comments section below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the Versus series here. It's a really fun series to make, and just kind of think about, if I had to rate things, if I had to compare things and put them on apples to apples, how do I first get them to apples? And then once they're there, how do I decide which is the better apple? So this has been Chris. Thank you guys so much for hanging out. I hope you guys are having a fantastic day, and I will see you next time.
We really appreciate you watching. We really, really, really do. We really appreciate you watching. We really, really do. A 30-second end screen is so long. I don't know how to fill all this time.